If you want to climb fast in teamfight tactics, you're going to have to know the best comps in the meta. We are about halfway through the set, and we are also in week 2 of patch 13.8. So we've made a couple of changes to the meta snapshot, and I added a new section for each comp. So let's go into the summary, and then after that, we'll go over how to play each and every one of these. So first things first, Star Guardian Kai'Sa is still the queen of the patch so far. This works really well either alone as Kai'Sa Reroll or complementing her with a Misfortune. And then after that, Mech plus anything is going to be still solid, and then Spellslinger moves up 1 tier. Spellslinger is better than a lot of the other 4-cost comps because there's a very smooth transition into it. There are a lot of different item holders you can use before you get into your final build, so it's good at stabilizing during stage 4 without rolling too much, and then of course during stage 5 you could finally hit the power spikes, whereas other comps you need to kind of get lucky on stage 4, and if you wait all the way till stage 5 to roll all your gold, you often die before you get to that point. Let's move on into the A tier now. Lasercorps, very powerful if you get the right setups for it. This is very augment dependent, so if it wasn't so augment dependent, it would be in the S tier, but it is, so that's just how it is. It's either A tier without the Lasercorps augments, but then like S plus with them. Yasuo Reroll, still very solid, but I don't think they're super OP, so I did bump them down. Infiniteam, decent. I think they were a little overrated, and we were talking about that a little bit last week, so that's why they are bumped down a little bit. Still a solid comp, nothing wrong with them. Jax moved up in the A tier a little bit. There's a player right now playing brawlers really heavily, and I'll show them to you once we get there, but he does it a little differently than everyone else. Anima, Misfortune, similar situation to Infiniteam. So Anima Squad and Infiniteam are both really good at lower levels. So if you're below Diamond, below Masters, these 2 comps are going to be your bread and butters. But I've noticed that like Masters Plus, Infiniteam and Misfortune seem to perform a lot worse. Threats, overall, they're still solid comps, and there are always opportunities to go for them no matter what level you are. Threats, solid still. Mascot Vex requires a bit of a specific setup, but very strong when built. Built different. You definitely prefer Prismatic built different, but the gold one is still takeable. Ashe Reroll, only play this if you get her augment early, and in that case it's very solid. Gnar Reroll, only play that with a plus Gadgettine augment. It's probably like B plus tier without it and S with it, so that's why it averages out to around A. Jhin, not your first choice, but still okay. Jinx Reroll, it's weaker than Yasuo Reroll, but still worth a mention. And then Hearts, I bumped up from B tier. I moved Duelists down. I thought Duelists were going to be a little bit better this patch, but they ended up being a bit worse, so I just knocked them out of the A tier right there. Lucian Reroll, Draven, Leblanc Hacker in C tier. That's going to be it for the summary. Let's move on into how to play each of the comps. Also, do check out the early game augment guide if you have not already, because this will tell you everything you need to take, which augments to take at stage 2-1 based on whether they're silver tier, gold tier, prismatic, all the hero augments. So if you're ever wondering like, oh, I'm not sure what augment to take at the start of the game, definitely check that out, both the video and the guide on the website, bunnymuffins.lol/augments. And then of course you could find this page at bunnymuffins.lol/meta. But let's move on into how to play the comps. So I did go over a lot of these last week. Not too much has changed for Star Guardian Kai'Sa. I will mention which comps have a lot of differences, but you pretty much just want the static shiv on your Kai'Sa and then 2 other offensive items. This comp is S tier regularly, so if you're just playing regular Kai'Sa, it's already S tier, and then once you get Star Guardian Spatula from the Star Guardian emblem, it's going to turn into S++. This is by far the most played comp and one of the most powerful right now, so you probably will be contested, but sometimes that's okay, because if you're contested Kai'Sa and you can't hit Kai'Sa 3, you could still play around Misfortune, especially if you get the Star Guardian emblem. Main tank going to be either Echo or Rel, depends who you're playing around. If you're doing the reroll version, Rel's going to be your main tank at 3-star. If not, 2-star Echo is going to be perfectly fine. And then finally, I'm going to show you guys a new section I added, best emblem/spatula holder. And I'm going to do this for all the S and A tier comps. So obviously it's just going to be Misfortune. That's like, we literally have it in the picture, but sometimes we don't always include it in the picture because it's not a pivotal part of the comp. And of course, if you want to delve a bit deeper, you could check out the how to play section on the website, bunnymuffins.lol/meta. And of course, we also have item recommendations down here. So again, static shiv that we mentioned before, that's highlighted right now. So that's always going to be core. And then Spear of Shogun's good for attack speed, Giant Slayer good for general damage. I like Archangels the most. The ordering of these items don't really matter too much. I'd rather just slam a good item. So if you see the item here and it's buildable for you, just build it. Don't greed for 3 specific items. The only thing you actually need is a static Shiv, and then after that, you're just playing around whatever's strongest for your team. For Misfortune, Spear of Shojin's really good. Any AP or damage amplification gonna work perfectly as well. And then the core of the build, 4-star Guardian and 2 Quick Draw. Well, let's move on into the next team composition, which is Mech Sureshots or the Mech Threat build. So the way this works is you play the Mech, Wukong, Garen, and Jax. That's gonna be the core of the comp. And then after that, you need to find some damage dealers because you already have a tank fully built out for your comp. So the 2 damage dealers you could play in this comp is Samira or Bel'Veth. Those are going to be your primaries. So if you get Samira 2, play Samira 2. If you get Bel'Veth 2 on your roll down, play Bel'Veth 2. They pretty much use the same items. It's just Last Whisper plus healing item and then any third item. So healing is mandatory on Bel'Veth, but it's optional on Samira. So do keep that in mind. The only thing that they truly share is like Last Whisper and pure damage items. And then if you're playing the Mech Sureshot version, as you see in the picture here, paired up with some Sureshots, Sivir plus Ezreal. Obviously, Ezreal is going to be your late game bomb. And then if you're playing the Bel'Veth version, just play Bel'Veth plus Aurelion Sol. Going to be very, very powerful for your team because it's more so of a flex comp than tunneling in on whatever you see in a picture over here. But the best emblem and spatula holder is no one, pretty much. You don't really need to Mecha Prime any specific unit because normally the only thing better than Garen to Mecha Prime is maybe like a legendary unit such as Mordekaiser, but those comps are very, very rare and you don't really play around those builds. So just always play around your Garen. Of course, if you do get 5 Mecha Prime, you could just put it on like your Sivir or something like that because you don't really care if she gets transformed or not. Or put it on a random legendary unit if you want to just give them random stats because the non-meched up units still benefit from having the trait active if you're at 5 Mecha Prime. After that, for Sureshot emblem, Bel'Veth is going to be the best carrier. But to be honest with you all, Bel'Veth, not that important to hold the Sureshot crest with. It's just something that's there if you happen to get that emblem. One important mistake that people make with this comp is that you need to focus on tank items for your Garen. A lot of people, they focus on the Samira items because they read this part and they're like, oh, Last Whisper is required. But the actual most important thing is having 3 tank items on Garen. Of course, you still need the Last Whisper, but getting 3 items on your mech is just so important because mech just really relies on all of its items. But we have the Bel'Veth items down here as well, and also the Aurelion Sol in case you are playing around that. But next build up, we have Oxforce Spellslingers. I did note that I am going to give out the best emblem and spatula holders as one of the new things for the meta snapshot. But another thing I want to start doing is doing the BunnyMuffins tip of the day, and I'll always show these at the end of each video, so you definitely have to stick around for that. But onto this build, we have the Oxforce Spellslinger, a very tried and true build. We mentioned this before, but the strength of the comp comes from having a lot of different item holders before you pivot into the final comp. A common mistake that people make is trying to get the comp you see in the pictures on stage 4-1 or 4-2 when they roll down, and that's another mistake. Sometimes you have to go for it when you're desperate, but most games you don't need to. And Spellslingers is a great example of that because you could play a lot of different stuff during stage 4. You don't need to reach your final team comp on that roll down. So instead you could play around Sona, you could play around LeBlanc, you could play around Kai'Sa. We have all those item holders listed down here. And you may notice that a lot of other comps, they have like 1-cost item holders, maybe a 2-cost item holder, but they don't have like 3-cost item holders, let alone this many, which again is why this comp is so powerful because you could play around both Twisted Fate and Nico and then just run the generic 4 Oxforce frontline. This comp is pretty solid overall, and it seems to be one of the top picks for a lot of the stronger players. So I think Spellslingers is better if you are above Masters, a little bit worse if you're below Masters. So bump it down or up a tier based on your rating. So that's going to be the opposite for Lasercorps and Infiniteam, as we talked about earlier. So whenever you're looking at builds, for example, or data, always make sure that you're focused on what's going to help you the most, not necessarily what's going to help everyone or a specific subset of people the most. But let's move on into the A tier. A tier is going to be Lasercorps. Lasercorps, very powerful right now, and I want to show you guys something really, really cool because there is one player who is kind of combining. He's the rank 2 in Europe West right now, and he is combining Lasercorps and 4 brawlers. He's one of the few people I see playing 4 brawlers, and he's playing it in like half his games right now. So we see this like first. One of them's with Star Guardian, but let's take a look at some of these because it's pretty interesting to me. He's playing Blitzcrank a lot in these builds, which typically isn't seen in Lasercorps. And then he's combining that with Renekton and Warwick because they both fit already into the build, and then adding in Riven or Vi as a fourth brawler. In this game, he uses Riven. In these other 3 games, he uses Vi. This one, he uses Riven. And it seems he's got something figured out that other people just do not. What's most interesting to me is that in these 4 first place games that he got with Lasercorps, only 2 of them have Lasercorps Heart. The one with the Vi support augment doesn't, and the one with the Warwick support augment doesn't. So it makes Lasercorps kind of work a little bit better. I guess here he does have the Lasercorps emblem, probably from Atoma traits, but I guess there's still one example of him doing well first place without having a fully 6 Lasercorps team, which is still very interesting, even though it kind of like makes the point a little weaker. But pretty much I have not seen anyone else play the 4 brawler version, and it definitely is something to kind of look into. If you guys are curious about like where I look up players, it's going to be on teamfight.lol. We already have some links going to there already. But pretty much you just go to the homepage and then search up whoever you want. But going back into this tier list, we have the hacker version right now. But again, you could just drop the hackers for the brawlers if you so choose. I think both versions have their merits. It's always going to depend on what your game is. We didn't actually watch each and every one of those games. He could have just hit everything and it didn't really matter what he played. But maybe it is the Blitzcrank that's kind of making the big difference here. Regardless of all that analysis though, this comp really shines with a +1 Lasercorps. I personally don't think it's worth to play without it, but if you do get it, this comp goes from like A to like S+. It's just kind of hard to get, and without it, the comp is like much weaker. If you compare that to the Kaisa comp, it's S tier without the Star Guardian emblem, but then S++ with the Star Guardian emblem. But yeah, all you really need is good frontline and Warwick items. And Warwick just needs some survivability, so it's like Edge of Night is good, healing items are okay. But I guess I should add to the requirements here is +1 Lasercorps, because that really unlocks a comp. Another good thing about this build is that you do have a good item holder. You could use Bel'Veth as another 4 cost before you find Warwick. And if you ever get an early 2-star Bel'Veth, she's going to be doing a lot of damage along with the Lasercorps debuff. But all in all, again, none of this stuff matters unless you hit +1 Lasercorps and Mordekaiser in order to like fully unlock the power of the comp, because it's really all in the trait. Next up, we have Yasuo Reroll. We did drop this comp a little bit from the S tier to the A tier. It's still very good. It's just so situational. You just have to play around the Yasuo augment, and it's not like game breaking compared to other hero augments that we've seen in the past that we did put in the S tier. So most like low cost hero augment rerolls, those are typically going to be put in the A tier unless they're like super meta defining. But the good augments for this build is obviously going to be like Battle Mage. That's like the perfect thing for Yasuo. It gives him survivability and ability power. Anything good for reroll such as Preparation, Golden Ticket, Trade Sector going to be nice. And then of course like Featherweight's great for Yasuo. And then just focus on getting the Quicksilver Sash. That's going to be the most important item for Yasuo by far. I see a lot of players, they just go 3 damage items, and you could still do well with it. I'm not saying you can't, but Quicksilver just adds a lot more consistency to the build because he just can't get CC'd. What I love about this comp the most is that you run 4 2-cost units, so you can just roll forever at level 6 and hit everything, and then you just stay at like 4 Duelists. You don't play like Twisted Fate or Vayne until later on because you don't really care about them that much. Another important thing about this build is having lockets. So just put your lockets on Nyla or Fiora. Both of them work just fine. And it just gives your team a lot of tankiness. So Duelists, they add a lot of damage to your team, but then you're lacking a bit on tanks. So you run the lockets to kind of compensate for that. Next build up we have is Infiniteam. So Infiniteam did get nerfed a little bit, especially like just based on the trait. And this was another type of comp that is reliant on their trait. And also a lot of people are taking your Samiras, so it's harder to go for Samira 2-star because she's kind of like your primary carry, at least in the stage 4 and stage 5 sections. Even in stage 6, she's kind of still your primary carry unless you luck out and hit an Ezreal 2. And then your main tank, Garen, isn't really an Infiniteam, is he? So that makes this build a little bit more awkward. Overall, it's still a pretty solid comp though. The best spatula holders for this is going to be Garen, Aatrox, Fiddlesticks, and Mordekaiser, but it's 99% of the time going to be Garen unless some reason you just don't get him because there are too many mech players in your game, which I guess does happen a bit, but sometimes you could still get Garen 2-star even if it's kind of contested. But if you don't, just replace it with like Aatrox, Fiddlesticks, or Mordekaiser. I will say like Aatrox is kind of like a bad unit right now, but in this specific build, he's still like decently okay. So you definitely want to start out with Infiniteams in the early game in order to play this comp. Some comps you could kind of pivot into. Some comps you could like start with, let's say, an Anima squad opener and then transition into Spellslingers or something like that. But with Infiniteam, you generally want to play it from the start. At least that's how I prefer to do it. I don't really play other stuff, then pivot into Infiniteam, because it's really awkward to do because you want Samira items, you want Sureshots, and those units just don't really fit into any other team comp. And then the items, it's going to be like a Last Whisper. It kind of like tunnels you into like an AD path. Similar to other vertical trait comps, this one plays around having 7 Infiniteam. You really want the Infiniteam Crown, Heart, or Crest, which gives you +1 Infiniteam. And it's not as important as a Lasercorps one, but it's still very, very solid, and it turns this comp from like A- to like A+ or S- with that build, or with that item. It's not that running 5 Infiniteam is horrible, but it's just one of those things where it really unleashes the full potential of the comp. So another thing to keep in mind is you want to decide when you go Infiniteam. So we already said you want to go for it when you have Infiniteams at the very start of the game, but another sign to go for them is if you get a Hex in the front row as your first Infiniteam Hex, and then the second one be in the back row somewhere. So sometimes you get 2 in the front row and 2 in the back row, and those generally are a lot weaker. And then sometimes you get 1 in the back row that comes first, and then the second one is in the front row. That's slightly weaker than having 1 in the front row versus 1 in the back row later on. I'm not saying you can't play it in every scenario, you definitely can, but I generally prefer the one where you get the one in the front line first and then the one in the back row second. Let's move on into the next build, which is the Jax build. You could also do Warwick carry. This is kind of like a dual carry comp, and you don't have to go for Jax. You could go for Warwick primary carry with vertical brawlers. I've definitely been seeing that a lot from some of the top players right now, and the build is gonna differ a little bit, but generally, you want to just focus on the damage items on Jax, and Jax reroll I think is stronger, but sometimes the game gives you a lot of Warwicks and no Jaxes, and in those cases, you just play your Warwick 2 and just hope for the best. What's great about those builds is when you play around Warwick carry, you could add in a Mordekaiser to get to 3 Lasercorps, and Mordekaiser is a great user of the Brawler emblem. He's going to be doing a lot of damage with it because he is a frontline unit that deals damage, so any sort of survivability to him, especially 8 Brawler buff, is gonna just allow him to cast a lot more. Also, Mordekaiser overheals a lot whenever you build a healing item on him, but with Brawler buff, he has so much health that like he loses a lot more because he's getting focus or whatever more, and then the overhealing that he normally does isn't overhealing anymore because he just has so much to heal now. But the only requirement for this comp when you do play for Jax, which is like the main version of this build, is to have rapid fire cannon or scope weapons, because you just really need the extra range on Jax. It's not impossible to play without it, but it's definitely one of those things that helps a ton. Next build up we have is Anima Squad Misfortune. So Anima Squad, as we said before, much better if you're below Masters. If you're above it, it's probably like in the mid A tier. If you're below Masters, it's probably in the S tier, maybe like regular S, not even S-. You just have to make sure you're able to get stacks at the beginning of the game, and not everyone is able to do that. So I only go for this build if you have a lot of copies of Anima units, not necessarily 3 Anima on stage 2-1, but if you have like 6 copies of Anima units, you have like 2 Nasuses, 2 Jinxes, 2 Sylases, then yeah, go for the build. But unless you have something crazy like that, I try to avoid playing for the comp. One good thing about this build though is that you have like unlimited users for the Anima Spatula. Since it gives health, AD, and AP, literally anyone can use it. So I just list out the best units in the game right now, like Fiddlesticks, Urgot, and then Garen's very solid in the build because Garen just is AoE CC, and then Echo's always played in this comp because you like having Prankster on the team because you run Jinx anyways. So Echo's always really good. And also Misfortune is just pretty powerful right now because Quick Draw is pretty decent, and she really only needs 1 item, which is Spear of Shojin, but I found that there are other ways around it, such as building Archangel Staff, which also gives a lot of mana. Next build up we have is Threats. So Threats, you want to play either Mech Threat, which is probably the better version of this build right now. It's pretty much just the Mech comp without the Sureshots. So you just take out all the Sureshot units, you take out Shen and Riven, and then you just play infinite threat units. So Morgana, Aurelion Sol, Fiddlesticks, Belveth, Urgot, things like that. Pretty much everyone you see here. It's just going to be the kind of default board for threats, and you can play this without threat level maximum. It's not like a augment dependent comp. It's kind of just like a secondary option, just like how it's always has been. Vex Reroll is the next build up. I typically only go for this if I have a blue buff early on, or if I get an early Vex with like a potential super start, because supers are really good in the mid game for Vex. So what ends up happening is that you roll on stage 3-2 at level 6 for 3 supers and 4 mascot, and that's going to be like your mid game board, and then eventually you pivot into like a 6 mascot board that you see here. Make sure you keep your Zac next to your Vex. That's the only like quick tip I have on this build, because you want to make sure that you get the Riftwalker buff on the right unit. So I always just leave my Pyke and Jhin on the other side, and then if I do need to swap, I swap both my Pyke and my Jhin with Zac and Vex. So one trick you could do is leave everyone in the back line, and then when you swap at the last second, because you saw your matchups and you want to be on the right side and not the left side, you just kind of switch them like this, and that way you only have 2 swaps. But if you don't need to swap, then have Zac in the front line, obviously, because he's a better tank. You don't want to swap like this, because sometimes Pyke doesn't actually survive up front without like some items, or if he's 3-star, but sometimes you don't get him 3-star. So that's like a quick little tip. I guess that could be our tip of the day right now for swapping with Riftwalkers. Have your Zac near your carry instead of in the front line, because I know like tanks we automatically put in the front line, but if you want to do some fast swaps sometimes, just leave him in the back and do this so that everyone else is still in the same position. But all in all, this comp is just a slow roll comp. You just re-roll for Vex at level 7, and that's pretty much going to be it. You just find a time to all in. Typically when I have like 7 Vexes, that's when I'll roll down all the way to 0 to try to find her. But sometimes you are in a situation where you have low life total, such as like you're at 30 life or 25 life, and then you kind of have to all in at that point anyways if you're at, say, like 5 or 6 Vexes. Next up is Built Different. Built Different's still pretty solid. Obviously, the prismatic version going to be a ton better. Just remember, you can play duplicate units, so you could play 2 Samiras, 2 Misfortunes, 2 Garens, 2 Echoes whenever you're doing this. So always keep that in mind whenever you're playing this, because you can make more econ than you can a lot of times in the mid game if you just play a pair of Rivens, for example, or play a pair of Shens instead of 1 Shen and 1 Jax, for example. But typically you play this comp to top 4 with. It's kind of hard to win the game. I have some good examples of how to play Built Different in the video I posted on Wednesday, which goes over how I did in a tournament recently with Built Different. Even though I didn't place well in that game, it goes over a lot of the decisions that you need to make in Built Different comps and some of the mistakes I made, which are really important for the build. Next up, we have Ashe Reroll. This is just typical 1-cost reroll. Get the Ashe carry augment early on stage 2-1, build a Last Whisper. Hopefully you have like 3 copies of Ashe already, so when you get the orb, you have 4 copies. And then roll down to level 30 on stage 3-1. And then econ all the way back up to 50, and then slow roll down to 50 until you hit Ashe 3. And then you could use kind of like the same all-in rules that we talked about before when we went over Vex. Gnar Hacker's another build. This comp definitely is a lot weaker. Maybe I should have moved this to the B tier now that I look at it again. But it's still good, but only if you get the Gadgettine augment. When you get the Gadgettine augment, you turn into a S++ comp. But unless that happens, it's definitely like low A, maybe high B tier, but it's the same Gnar Hacker build that we saw before. You just like hacker your Gnar over to the back line, and that's going to be all you really have to do for this build. 3-star Gnar is great, but 2-star Gnar is more than enough. But you do still want to slow roll for him at level 7, similar to what we did with the Vex build. But onto the next build, we have Jhin Renegades. Jhin, not my first choice right now, but if you're going for the mech comp, and you're building Last Whisper, going for either Samira or Bel'Veth, Jhin is kind of like a fallback that you can kind of go to. But I'll let you all go to the website and check that out if you are in one of those situations where you have to play Jhin. I'm not saying he's bad, there are just better options. And until those better options become worse, Jhin is just going to take like the 3rd seat, you know? That's the thing, he's not even like your first backup option. Bel'Veth is your first backup option. Jhin is your 3rd backup, so it's like the 3rd string quarterback. You just typically don't use them that much. But sometimes when everyone's injured, you have to pull them out. Jinx Reroll, this is just a very good 2-cost reroll augment. Whenever a reroll augment is going to be doing really well in a patch, that's typically when I'll add them to the comp list. Even though a lot of other carry augments for 1 and 2 costs are viable than what we list out here, unless they're like super meta defining, or if they're just like flat out just pretty decent overall, such as like the Yasuo comp. That's gonna be like the cause for them to be listed in these builds. Jinx is probably working best in just like the typical Anima squad build. You could still run Misfortune, which is really great, and then you just play all the Anima squad units. If you slow roll for her, which you typically should do, you could also go for Nasus and Sylas 3 if you have a lot of copies of them. If not, just focus on Jinx 3 and then play like Riven and Echo as your main tank and potentially get Riven 3-star later on. Next build up we have is Ashe Reroll. This is a comp that I bumped up from the B tier. You typically only go for this if you have specifically blue buff and a lot of Sonas. Lee Sin, I've actually seen Cleansing Safeguard do pretty well, even though on average it's horrible. It's just you need to pick it in very, 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 very specific spots. I think the data is kind of like really biased right now because a lot of people are taking Cleansing Safeguard because they heard like a couple patches ago that it was good, and then they didn't know it got nerfed. It did get a small buff back. However, it's still a very weak augment, but if people don't keep up with the news and don't keep up with the meta like you all, they're going to be ruining the data for some augments, at least in my opinion. Another thing is that since the build is much weaker than it was before, you have to play it differently as well. So I bet the people who are taking Cleansing Safeguard right now are playing it the old way, which you probably don't want to do anymore. But that's kind of besides the point. You want to play this comp generally with like the Sona augment instead of the Cleansing Safeguard one until they buff it back up again, just because Sona is going to be your main carry right now. Blue buff plus any 2 AP items, that's really all you need. Syndra's a great late game. And then apart from that, you really just play heart units and then just reroll for like Sona plus Lee Sin, and you could also play super. So I'm going to make a note down here in the emblem/spatula holder section. You generally heart your Leblanc if you do get an extra slot, but if you're running supers, which you definitely can with this build, just replace like Echo and someone else and run Malphite, you get Mascot with the Alistair, and then Gangplank. Gangplank is going to be a great holder for the Hard Spatula because he does cast pretty often, which gives your team a little bit more AP. He will die pretty quickly, but it's better than kind of nothing. But yeah, this plays out like any other 3-cost reroll comp, and we say it over here, like Sona's going to be the priority, and then because she's 3-cost, roll for her 3-star at level 7. Not too much has changed there. That's going to be it from the A comps. In the B tier, we have the Duelists. Duelists a little bit weak right now. I moved them down just because of that. Let's see what else we have. Lucian Reroll. Yeah, it got nerfed before, so it kind of stays down here. Draven Reroll. Yeah, Draven. I haven't seen any top players playing Draven, and the data has him below average. So I just can't really recommend playing this comp, even though there are very specific scenarios. Maybe like 1 out of 50 games you could play this. But overall, like 1 out of 50 is very low. So I would just avoid this for now. And then C tier Leblanc Hacker, just don't play it. It got nerfed way too hard. And then for the items, I didn't really change this from last week because I think it's still the same. You're mainly prioritizing the AD build. So Bow is going to be the most important for that. Bow works in both the Star Guardian Kai'Sa build because you need Static Shiv, and Giant Slayer also works on Kai'Sa. And then you're going for Mech Sureshots. So you don't really need to go into AP. Even like the Spellslinger build, they also use Static Shiv. So Bow just works in like all the comps right now, so I think it's the most important item. If you're going for mechs and you're just like a mech one trick, probably grab a defensive item such as a Negatron Cloak. Dragon Claw, I think might be one of the best items right now. And then Spellslingers, again, you want the Static Shiv. There's not really too much else to add there. Static Shiv actually fits in a lot of comps, and Bow works really well because of that. Bow also works well for Last Whisper, as we said before, and then for Jax, it's good for RFC, Infiniteam, Last Whisper. You could even do Static Shiv in the Anima Squad comp. Every comp can use a bow. Maybe Vex can't, but like Vex is a very specific comp that plays around its own rules. So I guess if you're a Vex one trick and you only like playing AP comps, then you go for the tier. But really just like chase that bow in the early game. That's really all there is to it right now. So just to sum up again, like Kai'Sa is just S++ right now. There's just no getting around that. If you do play the Star Guardian build, expect to be contested. Luckily, it's not one of those comps where like 3 or 4 people can play. Generally, only 2 people can play it. Typically, it's going to be 1.5. So some games you'll be uncontested. Some games you'll be super contested. The only champions right now that are like impossible to get is probably Garen, Echo, and Misfortune. Garen and Echo are always good because they're like the best 4-cost tanks, and they're mainly damage dealers in the 4-cost category. And then Misfortune is just used both in the Star Guardian build and the Anima Misfortune build. But for the BunnyMuffins tip of the day, we already went over it already, but I'll just reiterate it again. If you're ever playing Renegades and you want to do a fast swap, such as like swapping your carry over to the other side at the end of the round, you always have to make sure that your Zac is closest to the trait that you want activated. In this case, we want it activated on the Mascot one. To do that, we just right-click it and then select Mascot for the team builder, but in-game, it's always going to be the closest unit to your Vex. So instead of swapping like this, where you could potentially jeopardize the health of your Pyke, move your Zac to the second or third row. It could be like something like this or like this, and then swap them like that. If you have Zac in the front row, again, you risk getting your Pyke killed. But if they're down a row a bit, you can get a quick swap off with just 2 clicks instead of going for 3 clicks, because when you do it like this, you have 1, 2, 3 clicks. But if you have them all set up in the back already, it's just going to take 2 clicks to kind of do. In-game, it's easier than like on the website, obviously. But that's going to be the tip of the day. I'm going to try to do this every video, and it'll typically be at the end. But that is going to be it from me today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you have not already, and hit the like as well. And apart from that, I will see you all next time. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.